sanctions and Putin's kind of drive to fuel the war economy has really sent inflation soaring. The economy's overheating. The central bank can't rein it in. It's pushed up interest rates to 21%. All the Putin's big business allies are horrified. They're saying we're going to go bankrupt if this continues.
President Trump has threatened Russia with tariffs and more sanctions if President Putin doesn't start negotiating the end of the war in Ukraine. So how is the Kremlin likely to take that and react? Catherine Belton reports on Russia for The Washington Post. She's the author of Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia, Then Took on the West. It was a Times Book of the Year, which, given the detail and the revelation in it, is hardly surprising. Catherine, welcome to the programme. Let me start by asking you this. Is there enough trade now between Russia and America for more sanctions and tariffs to be a serious threat to the Kremlin?
There isn't really enough trade between the US and Russia at all. Europe has always been Russia's biggest trading partner, but more sanctions would certainly hurt because the Russian economy is already in great pain despite Putin's assertions otherwise. We've got inflation officially at 9.5%. Actually, in real life, it's probably double that. The price of potatoes went up 88% last year, and that's because sanctions and Putin's kind of drive to fuel the war economy has really sent inflation soaring. The economy's overheating. The central bank can't rein it in. It's pushed up interest rates to 21%. All the Putin's big business allies are horrified. They're saying we're going to go bankrupt if this continues. But Putin is determined, nevertheless, to continue his war, and he probably can at least for another year.
Well, you raise an interesting issue there, because although it's clear Ukraine is struggling on the battlefront and Russia has been making marginal gains, slow but sure, I would guess, but you point out Russia is struggling on the economic front. I see that it's even having to deplete its sovereign wealth fund to pay for the war, that it's now spent 2/3 of the liquid assets in that national welfare fund. It's down from, it was $113 billion before the war. It's now only $37 billion. There are labour shortages everywhere. But you're saying that Mr. Putin could probably survive these kind of economic pressures for another year.
Yes, he probably can. I mean, given the central bank has yanked up interest rates so high, at some point the inflation will start to cool down, and he is determined. He still sees Ukraine as an existential threat. He's determined to make Ukraine capitulate, and he is betting that he can survive for longer than Ukraine can. I mean, because even as Trump is making these threats about sanctions, he's also made clear he's going to cut military aid to Ukraine. And even now, Russia has the upper hand. So if Trump cuts military aid to Ukraine, then Russia can continue to progress, and Putin sees no need to halt the war when his troops are doing pretty nicely, and he can keep going for at least another year.
Yes, if Mr. Trump was to cut the aid to Ukraine before any kind of negotiations got underway, that would be a signal for Mr. Putin just to bash on. I can understand that. Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN has emphasized the need to address, quote, the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. What does he mean by the root causes?
Well, they believe, Russian officials very strongly believe, or they're trying to paint the Ukraine war as a battle of necessity. They say it's because NATO is encroaching on our borders. They want a demilitarized status for Ukraine, i.e. they want it to have hardly any army at all. They don't want it to be part of NATO. And they're really trying to lure Trump into much broader talks about the whole of Europe's security architecture. They want a new Yalta II process in which Russia gets to play a much bigger role in Europe, in which it has its own sphere of influence, almost stretching out to Warsaw Pact countries as during the Cold War. It really has great ambitions, and it's a big danger because if Trump gets lured into these negotiations and peace talks, Putin will certainly try to drag it out and use whatever leverage he can to have a greater say in European security. And obviously, that's a danger for everybody.
If the idea is that any peace deal involves a demilitarized Ukraine, if the existing battle lines are frozen and there are still these tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on these battle lines, that's something that would be very hard to agree to, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you would think so, because obviously that would just leave Ukraine almost completely undefended. I mean, but there's an issue because Trump himself has said that kind of Ukraine's attempts to enter NATO are what started this war. So there's a risk that in the end, because of Trump's history of kowtowing to Putin and his attempts to foster friendly relations, that in the end he capitulates because he's already signaled that he understands at least some of Russia's rationale for starting the war. So we have to see how things go during this year. But yeah, I don't think Europe is going to be very happy or want to allow Ukraine to agree to having a significantly diminished military. But it all depends on whether anyone is able to prop up Ukraine after this, because Russia, it feels it has the upper hand. If they can continue to progress militarily, they think by the autumn, President Volodymyr Zelensky's hold on power is going to be increasingly fragile, and they want to enforce a Russia-friendly Ukraine by any means necessary.
I see President Zelensky of Ukraine saying that the only way he could agree to a ceasefire and the existing battle lines is if US troops were deployed on the ceasefire line to ensure it stuck. I would have thought that you and I have more chance of going to Mars than Mr. Trump deploying US troops on that line.
Yeah, that's clearly not going to happen, particularly when the American president has very clearly stated he doesn't want the US involved in wars outside its borders. But another matter is whether there could be European troops there. The French are very actively discussing it, and the UK is getting ever more deeply involved in training Ukrainian troops.
That would be deeply unpopular. And for training Ukrainian troops, and we've been doing that since 2015. Training troops is one thing. Deploying British, French, even German, I don't know if German troops would be welcome in Ukraine, but deploying British, French in numbers as peacekeepers on a ceasefire line, which on the other side are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops, that's going to be a difficult one to sell to the British and French people.
I think but the French are actively discussing it now as they understand that the likelihood of a ceasefire being enforced is becoming more and more a reality. So they have to look at this as one way of maintaining the peace, because the risk is if they don't, then Russia at some point will be able to kind of rearm itself. It will be able to recover from the economic pain and start a new attack. So if Ukraine doesn't have a strong military, then somebody else has to be there to protect the border. Otherwise, Putin, as we know, he likes to test boundaries and he might go further.
How do you think Putin will respond to President Trump, given what he said so far? What happens next? I know we're only speculating here, but what do you think?
I think he might feel a bit prickly, actually. I don't think he was anticipating Trump to sort of come out with any guns blazing at all, or making any threats. Today, Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, has kind of sighed and said, well, we've heard all this before. Trump's administration imposed tough sanctions on us during his first term. But he said, we're waiting for a dialogue of respect. And so far, we haven't seen any such signals. They were hoping for the Trump of the first term, who did appear to kowtow to some degree to Putin. So far, they're not hearing it.
Well, we shall see. It's early days, of course. Catherine, thank you for joining us and going through these issues, fascinating issues. There'll be a lot more as the weeks progress. Catherine Belton there from the Washington Post, author of the excellent Putin's People.